Welcome on in, ladies and gentlemen. Three bold takes. Today we do have a special guest. Clint Lamb has joined the show with us to discuss a little bit more on Alabama and the transfer portal and things of that nature. So, Clint, I appreciate you joining the show. For those of you that don't know, Clint does work for On3 Sports and is an analyst for the Bama On Line YouTube channel, putting out content all the time on there. So, if you haven't, go ahead and subscribe to them and check their content out as well. Clint, thank you again for joining.
Yeah, absolutely, fellas. It's going to be fun. College football's changing pretty drastically, pretty rapidly. So anytime you're able to kind of hop on somewhere and hash it out a little bit, I think it's a good time.
All right, we want to welcome Clint back in with us for our third video today. Thank you for coming in with us. And we wanted to cover the Pac-12 and its dissolvement here in college football going into 2024 and kind of the impact that's going to have on the sport going forward, what you're taking from it, good or bad thing. Go ahead and let you lead in right there with us on that topic.
It was expected. I mean, I really thought the Big 12 was going to go with them, and they've done enough to hang on. For how long, though? The ACC's in trouble. We've, the two conference, mega conference thing, I think is very real. I don't think the SEC wants to entertain that. I think they're happy with where they're at currently. They don't want to add more teams. They would rather not go in that direction because it's just, there is no pride anymore in what you're a part of as far as at least I think right now it still is. With four, there's still some SEC pride. There's still some Big Ten. Can the Big Ten overthrow the SEC as being the dominant, conference? The Big 12, the ACC, are they really thinking they're going to establish themselves in that conversation? I mean, it's really playing for third at this point on that front. Not saying they can't have a team be competitive and maybe even win a national championship, but it's unfortunate because the Pac-12, the Pac-10, back when I really first started getting into it, it was the time zone difference affected things, but what you got was a brand of football that was different than the SEC, drastically different. It just being a West Coast kind of thing versus the South versus the North with the Big Ten, the ACC. It was different brands, and it was always interesting to watch those come together and see, how things, settled on the field. And granted, the SEC has been super dominant for the last 20 years. So, I mean, obviously you've kind of lost that a little bit, but I just think the regional pride was a huge part of the sport, and that's going away. And it's really started, in my opinion, with the recruiting. Once recruiting started going national and it wasn't getting a bunch of, if you were Auburn, getting a bunch of Alabama players and Georgia, players from the state of Georgia come into the program. They grew up around it. They love it. I think that's where things started. And then that just became, once the big TV deal started becoming a thing and networks got involved, it's only gotten worse. But I was a fan of the Pac-12. I really liked the structure with USC and Oregon and UCLA and Utah and Arizona State. Like, I just thought it was the perfect thing for what college football used to represent. Unfortunately, that's just not where we're at today.
Right. Yeah. It that's kind of what I was going to bring up is that aspect of it, but also it's sad in the fact that 4 or 5 years ago the Pac-12 was in a bad space competitively in college football. Like they were just that they were every team was like a dumpster fire. It seemed like. Now, the past 2 years, we've seen an uptick in quality of football that's being played in the Pac-12. It was some of the most fun games I had ever watched in the past 2 years. Staying up till midnight or 1 in the morning, watching them finish. Like, it was always fun for me. And so, do you think that maybe there was a potential for them to stay relevant with the uptick in the quality of football? Or do you think it just didn't matter whether or not there were the Oregons, the Utahs, like the things of that nature that could go into Columbus, Ohio and beat Ohio State on the road? Like, do you think that even mattered, or was it just an inevitable thing that was always going to happen?
I think just seeing how non-competitive the Pac-12 was, it painted a picture for where things were trending. Like it kind of took what was happening off the field and put it on the field, where you kind of. But I don't think it had a whole lot to do with it. I think it's the money driven programs, like the ones that are going to drive the revenue for these mega TV deals. The fact that the brands out there, it's not the same as it is in the Big Ten and in the SEC. Period. There's one or two. The ACC's got one or two. Maybe a couple of more than that, but it doesn't compare to the top. And now the Big 12, it had Texas and Oklahoma, so it was kind of the same thing where they had a couple of them. Texas A&M obviously had a lot of money, but their brand wasn't really nationally known to a degree that would drive major money deals. I think that's why Johnny Manziel was such a critical factor for them, and while we really need to discuss his impact on that program long standing after he left. I think he kind of put them on the map in a lot of ways, especially when he beat Alabama. But with USC and with UCLA, Oregon is one of those programs. UCLA, it's basketball, a lot more than football, but even with football, where it's located, the desirable location and all that stuff, that matters. But it's so tough to say because I think that it's all money driven, and I think they would have always been a major step behind as far as the TV deals they could have gotten. And once, money does drive all of this. So the TV deals matter to these schools. You can invest more in those programs, get better facilities, NIL stuff, the way that ends up working out. That certainly is going to impact things too. But it's a good question, and one that I don't really know how I feel about it, because I will say some people have viewed it as it was great they went out the way that they did, where they got better and it was a more enjoyable product before the end. And I think there's something to be said about that. But it also kind of just reminds you, like, what we were seeing the last 2 years is never really going to exist again. We're going to see, a USC team that's probably like, the Miami Dolphins traveling somewhere to play in the snow. It's like, they're going to struggle. That they go let let USC go over and play Michigan, and it's some kind of snow game or something, and it's going to be, you kind of know how that's going to play out before they even get on the field, because it's just not the brand that USC is used to playing, and maybe they adjust to it. And the timing of these games obviously matters too. Early season, late season, but it definitely looks drastically different than it even did within the last 5 years. And what's crazy is I think a lot of your major factors as far as moving the sport in a certain direction, that's already happened, like NIL and conference realignment to an extent. But I also think there's more that hadn't happened yet that's going to continue to move things in a very different direction that we don't even know is coming. And so that's kind of what I'm waiting to see, what everything looks like when it seems like things are starting to get settled in.
Yeah, so for me, I've kind of seen from Pac-12 athletes and all this over the past year, when they made the decision that they were going to, some of these teams are going to move to the Big Ten or the ACC, that a lot of these athletes came out and basically revolting, saying that they didn't want to because of the travel due to what they would, the sport they'd play, like volleyball, basketball, stuff like that. So kind of the thoughts on that is being a recruit, why should I go play for USC or Washington when they have to travel to Big Ten schools and do all this and that? What are your thoughts on that?
I think it's a major disadvantage. I really do. And that's kind of the cost of doing business in their minds, because they jumped off of what they viewed as a sinking ship, or at the very least a ship that was never going to be as big and strong and as desirable as the Big Ten and the SEC. And they saw an opportunity for themselves and they jumped. But that's the cost. They're going to have to travel a ton. I don't think that's going to be something that, it's exhausting traveling. I mean, anytime I got to go somewhere for a bowl game or something, I got to travel, to the Rose Bowl or out to Texas for the Cotton Bowl or whatever. It's like, man, it's exhausting. And just having to do that all the time. Football will be impacted by that, certainly, but it's these other sports that's really going to be hit, in my opinion, because that's something that how do you overcome that on the recruiting trail? Like, I mean, if two schools are kind of viewed equally, that travel is now going to be an obstacle that you have to overcome. And, it going the other way, that's not as bad, because if you're Michigan and you're traveling out to play USC, that's one game off your schedule. But, for USC, they're having to travel to play all these different Pac-12 or excuse me, Big Ten teams. So I do think it negatively affects them. And it's like with all this other stuff, I don't think we fully will know the impact of that until it actually happens.
Quinn, you're muted.
I wanted to hit on one. I apologize about that. I want to hit on one thing. In a lot of ways, it kind of saddens me because the thing that built college football is regionality and rivalries, and that aspect of the sport's what made it popular and financially viable. You look at a team like Nebraska, who, while they weren't winning the national title, they were highly competitive in the Big 12, and they've severely struggled ever since they went to the Big 10. I think a lot of that is a lack of any kind of recognition for the fans to hold on to, grudges to build on, and a lack of a recruiting base that recognizes them as a program. And while I think that last part might not kill the Pac-12 teams coming to the Big Ten because they have each other at least, do you think there's going to be any aspect of it where they're going to severely struggle to like build a brand in Big Ten play because of the fact that they're severe outsiders? Or do you think they'll be able to hold on to each other? And add to that, do you think the other Pac-12 teams that have found their way to the Big 12 are going to be able to build more success in that conference for themselves than the big brands do that ran to the Big 10?
That's actually a really good point as far as the Big 12 side of things for sure. Because you look at a program like Arkansas, and it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out which they never would because everything is money driven. But if they were to hop out of the SEC and go to the Big 12, they'd run that place with what's left. And it's like with the way things are currently structured, talking about automatic bids and everything, why would you not do that? You'd be in there, every other year. And from a on-field product stuff, that'd be exciting for that program. But at the same time, the check that you'd be cut every year from your TV deals, it wouldn't come close in comparison, and so you're not willing to make that move, even though it would give you a lot more success. Money is more important than success, or on-field success is what I'm trying to get at. But yeah, as far as USC being able to go to the Big Ten, build this brand, that will be difficult as well because as unfortunate as it is, and I'm not trying to go down this lane and get in this conversation at all, but with where things are at politically in this country, where there's like this, I mean, it's just from a region. You hate people, and really you don't need to know anything about them, just where they live. You're like, I know we wouldn't get along. It's like they are viewed as this West Coast style of program. There's going to be, and just as far as building this brand based off of, and granted, you're going to have your own fan base, and that's where it really matters. But just from a conference pride standpoint, USC is not going to be one of those teams. They're going to be viewed as an outsider, like they aren't even part. They'll play Big Ten teams every week, but they will not be viewed as a Big Ten team to Big Ten fans. That's kind of the way that I think it'll end up looking. In a program like Nebraska, I think that's also a good point. Granted, I think it was where the game was heading. Like you could recruit closer to home, those big cornbread fed styles of player, the offensive lineman, hammer the football, all that stuff. Now, are you going to go get somebody off the farm that can run a 4.75 or a 4.8 as an offensive tackle? Probably not. So it's a different. I think that's impacted things because recruiting has become more national. No one. I mean, no offense to them, but what's desirable about Nebraska? Absolutely nothing. So the only thing that really kept them in that conversation to that degree was the fact that a lot of people around that area that had pride in Nebraska, you had some good football talent, and so I think that impacted things to a degree, but you're also not wrong. They were competitive in the Big 12 way more than they've been in the Big 10. And I think that with USC, it's too big of a brand not to have some level of success, but it's just, you've put this burden on yourself for the sake of money, where it's an obstacle that UCLA, they will be going through it as well. But really, who else in college football will have to go through this to that degree? And that's where it's like, in Oregon too, same with them. Obviously, I keep leaving them out, but they're in this conversation as well. It's put a huge burden on the actual players and the coaches and things like that, and just something else that they have to overcome that really no one else does.